Welcome to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Haugo. This is Human Biology, Chapter 8, Part 2, and we are talking about the muscular system. And today we're going to start out talking about muscle structure. So the actual physical structure of muscles. So muscle cells are grouped in bundles. So these long rope-like cells are put in a bundle, and that's called a fascicle. And then they have connective tissue, specifically fibrous connective tissue, to hold that all together. And there's a nice picture on page 163 of that. So it shows the whole muscle. There we go. And then it shows the fascicles and the connective tissue and then the one cell. So fascicles are grouped into the whole muscle and held together with connective tissue. And let's go even further. So please write what's black, obviously, and then these, if you want to write, you can, but you don't have to. So each muscle cell is covered by connective tissue, and we call that connective tissue endomyosin. And each fascicle, so a group of muscle cells, is covered by more connective tissue, and we call that perimyosin. And then each muscle fascicle, like the whole bunch of fascicles get together to make the whole muscle, and then that whole muscle is covered by connective tissue, and we call that epimyosin or deep fascia. So all of that connective tissue is going to merge to form a tendon, the band of connective tissue that connects a muscle to a bone. So let's take a look at this picture. So here is all of that connective tissue merging together to form a tendon, which connects the muscle to the bone. And all that connective tissue surrounding the whole muscle is epimyosin or fascia. And then you can see that whole muscle is made up of a bunch of fascicles. So here's one fascicle, and that's covered by perimyosin. And you can see all the blood vessels and nerves and good stuff. And then that fascicle is made up of a bunch of muscle cells. And here is one muscle cell. And that muscle cell or muscle fiber is surrounded by connective tissue, what we call the endomyosin. And then that muscle cell is, you could break it down even more. So we're going to be talking about, so you can see it's nucleus, it's multinucleated, this thing called the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is like the endoplasmic reticulum in other cells, but it has a slightly different function, and anything that has to do with muscles either starts with the term myo, the prefix myo, or the prefix sarco. So here's the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and then you can see each muscle cell is made up of a bunch of myofibrils, which are then themselves made up of a bunch of protein filaments, protein strands. And we're going to talk about this structure more in depth. So, muscle cells in action. How do they do what they do? So, nerve impulses come from your brain and spinal cord, and they cause the skeletal muscle to contract. And some words you should be familiar with are motor unit, which is the single neuron and all the muscle fibers it controls, or muscle cells it controls, and the neuromuscular junction, which is where the nerve fiber connects with the muscle cell. So let's take a look at some of those. All right, taking a look at the motor unit, you can see there is one neuron, and then all of the axons of that motor neuron are going to different muscle cells. So all of this would be considered one motor unit. It would all act as one, because they would all get the same signal together. Then there is the neuromuscular junction, which you cannot see that. I'll bring myself down here. So we haven't gotten into the nervous system, so some of this will be a little bit of a preview. But you see you have an action potential coming down to the end of a neuron, this synapse, and ions. The nerve impulse causes these calcium ion channels to open up, so calcium ions flow in, and then that allows these vesicles to dump out their contents, which are neurotransmitters, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then those neurotransmitters, you can see, cling on to these protein channels and open them up, and a bunch of sodium ions rush in, and then the signal gets to the muscle that it should contract. So let's talk about muscle contraction. So during muscle contraction, the entire muscle shortens and becomes thicker. So your entire muscle shortens and becomes thicker. So each muscle cell in the whole muscle shortens and becomes thicker. This is because protein fibers slide past one another. The actin and the myosin don't actually get any smaller themselves, they just slide past each other. So actin and myosin do not get shorter. So let's talk about what's going on at that neuromuscular junction. So at the neuromuscular junction, the muscle contraction occurs when the muscle gets a message from the nerve at your neuromuscular junction. So please write that down. And when the the message is a chemical messenger. So we're going to talk about this in the nervous system. Chemicals called neurotransmitters, which are chemical messengers. And specifically when we're talking about muscles, the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. And that's released from the neuron. And then the neurotransmitters attach to a receptor protein on the muscle cell membrane. So if you remember, those little orange things attached to the protein channels on that second cell, which is the membrane of the muscle cell. And that creates an electrical impulse, which is called an action potential, which we'll talk more about in Chapter 9. That causes the action potential to spread across the muscle cell membrane and causes the muscle cell to contract. So there's a nice picture of this on page 165, figure 8.2, and obviously it'd be a lot easier for you to just look at it in your book. But you have the axon of a motor neuron, and then the muscle cell, and then backing up to A, it has an actual picture of a motor unit, and then those neuromuscular junctions. And then we looked at that, and then in C, you can see the neurotransmitters are going to the protein, the receptor proteins on the muscle cell membrane. And there's a big picture of that in D. And then E actually shows a real picture of it. It's an electron microscope photograph of the neuromuscular junction. And you can see all those mitochondria in there because it takes a lot of energy. And in class, we're going to review something from biology about muscle cells. The sliding filament mechanism of contraction. So when it's stimulated, and we just talked about how that happens with the neurotransmitter and the action potential on the muscle cell membrane, the myosin filaments slide and overlap with the actin filaments, and it brings bringing the actin filaments from each side closer together. So myosin would be connected to the actin on this side, and then another one on this side, and so then it brings, I don't have enough hands, these two closer together. So another term you should know is sarcomere, which is the subunit of a muscle cell, and that consists of a thick band of myosin. So myosin is a thicker protein, and a thin band of actin and on each side. So they're kind of lined up, and you've got myosin here, actin over there, and then, like I said, there's a bunch of them lined up, and that is a sarcomere. So when the actin and myosin filaments overlap, that sarcomere, let's see, there we go, gets shorter. And when all the sarcomeres in a muscle cell get shorter, the whole muscle cell shortens. And when all the muscle cells in a whole muscle shorten, then the whole muscle shortens, and that is a muscle contraction. So just like that, it got shorter. So there's a nice picture of that on page 167. Obviously, it'd be easier for you to look in your book, but we have a sarcomere. So you've got those thick blue myosin and the thin red actins on each side, and then you can see those club-shaped myosin heads reach up to touch the actin, and then in B you can see that the myosin and actin have slid past each other, and that the whole sarcomere has gotten shorter. And when the whole sarcomere gets shorter, then all the sarcomeres in a muscle cell get shorter, the muscle cell gets shorter. When all the muscle cells in a muscle get shorter, then the whole muscle gets shorter, and that's a contraction. So we looked at the nerve cell, and so now we're going to look at the muscle cell, a little review from biology. So we will watch that little video, that little animation in class. I want to talk a little bit more about the sliding filament mechanism of contraction. And in this, calcium ions are needed for muscle contraction. So you know calcium is important for bones and also for muscle contractions. And they are stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is that specialized endoplasmic reticulum we talked about earlier. And when they get the message from the nerve, the calcium ions in the sarcoplasmic reticulum are released into the cytoplasm of the muscle cell. And the calcium ions, once they're released, we're going to go more in depth on this, but they bind to a protein, and when you bind to a protein, it changes its shape, and that allows the myosin, those little Gulf heads, to attach to actin, and then it brings the actin filaments closer, and that shortens the muscle cell, which shortens the whole muscle. So there's a nice picture of it on page 168. So you can see the myosin heads are not attached to the actin, but then when the calcium actually gets attached to the tropomyosin and the troponin, which are kind of like chaperone proteins, then they change shape and they allow the actin sites to be available, and then the myosin heads attach there, and then from the picture we looked at earlier, when the myosin heads attach, they slide over past each other and everybody shortens. So let's take a look at this. So at the neuromuscular junction, an action potential arrives at the nerve, and then here's the neuromuscular junction, and that action potential tells the neurotransmitters to be released, and then they bind to those those cell membrane proteins, and then that causes an excitation which releases calcium ions from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and then all those calcium ions go down to the troponin and tropomyosin sites, and then they get distracted, and then the actin binding sites are revealed, and the myosin hooks on, and then the actin and myosin slide past each other, and the muscle cell and the muscle contract. And that's a wrap. See you later.